This is the Schweinenbrück, or the pig bridge over the river Elbe, near Magdeburg. By the time I drove here from the nearby town, it was nearly dark, and historians who were brave enough to tackle the location of Hitler's remains mostly conclude that his ashes were most likely scattered from here along with those of his wife, Eva Braun, Goebbels and Goebbels' wife, and their children. Also included were the ashes of Blondie, his dog, and Hans Krebs, the General Chief of the Army General Staff. The last time that Hitler was publicly seen was on his 56th birthday when he left the Fuhrer bunker to present awards to a few Hitler youth. 10 days later, the Soviets were in the city, and there was street-to-street fighting within a block of the bunker. The inhabitants either made a mad dash or committed suicide by poison or bullet, and the generally accepted version of things is that Hitler killed himself, and some of his staff cremated him and his wife and all of these other people in a crater outside. But this leaves the question, what happened to Hitler's remains? Bodies don't simply disappear after being doused in gasoline and burned. The order of events seems to be that SS officer Erich Kempe, his driver, SS Obergruppenführer Otto Grunsch, and Martin Bormann carried Hitler and Eva Braun to the emergency exit before burning them. They were placed in a crater behind the garden of the Reich Chancellery, which was close to the bunker, and burned. Because the Soviets were so close, they had to rush to cover the bodies, which were now barely recognizable, and hurry back to the bunker. We saw this in a scene from the movie where they just burned the bodies and headed back in before a bomb dropped, but in reality they buried them in a sort of shallow grave. Hitler's valet himself noted that the fire did not totally destroy the bodies. After the Russians cemented control over the area, the grave of the Hitlers was discovered, along with the charred bodies of the Goebbels family in the courtyard. These were placed in wooden ammo boxes and transported to the Soviet Army headquarters in the town of Plotzensee. Elena Rezvaya, the interpreter for Smersh, was in the unit in charge of finding Hitler's remains. Smersh was in fact awarded control of high-profile intel in relation to this. They caught guards and doctors in the bunker, all of which provided testimony that matched. Vice Admiral Hans Voss identified the bodies of Goebbels and Krebs for the Soviets. Dental records further identified that this indeed belonged to Hitler. These records were all brought to an area near Smersh headquarters at a hospital in Berlin, but were later moved a few more times before finally settling in Magdeburg near West End Strasse, or West End Street. Here, scenes of the city today, now mostly decaying classic buildings and industrial sites. Hitler and Eva were buried at number 32 under a garage where the autopsy was done. Understand this is sort of a car repair area. You had a concrete area which a car could be driven over, and then there was a depression underneath for workers to sit and work. But because they didn't want anybody burrowing in and finding these bodies, because also if you look at the collaborators in, for example, Belgium, those bodies were dug up, and it's believed now are kind of being worshipped by these weird fascist cults. But they didn't want anybody getting their hands on Hitler's body because this would be a sort of cult of hero worship. So they were buried in this cement structure, surrounded on all sides. The house at number 32 matched perfectly. It was a garage, and it was, in all intents and purposes, a perfect place to hide two bodies. These moves were prompted by Soviet fears that insiders within Smersh would leak the location of Hitler's body and that it might be stolen by neo-Nazis. And as I mentioned with the collaborators in Belgium, this has some historic precedence. The Goebbels couple, their 6 kids, and Krebs were moved to 36 just down the road from where Hitler and Eva Braun were buried, and they were buried in the garden behind, not surrounded by concrete, because nobody really cared about Goebbels. Hitler had that cult solely around him. And Smersh eventually was dissolved and absorbed into the KGB, which vacated the property here in 1970. At the time, the leader of the group, Andropov, authorized an operation to finally destroy the bodies for good. They were tired of keeping track of them and watching the properties, and in April they exhumed the wooden boxes and totally incinerated them just to dust at a nearby military base. It's said that they drove them out to the runway and just kept dumping gasoline on them until it was nothing but fragments of bone and nails. A team of 3 KGB men posed as fishermen and dumped their ash into the river Elbe at a tributary of the Elbe and were gone 20 seconds after they began. It's said that his dental work survived and has DNA tested as a match, although the Russians refused to release this data. So nobody really knows if these bodies belong to Hitler and Eva and Goebbels, but the Russians assure us that they do. The skull fragment often claims to be Hitler's doesn't actually match up with him, but this may have been misinformation from the Soviets. Whatever the case, the leader of the KGB claims that their bodies are all dumped, along with everyone else in the bunker, from this isolated bridge. But we all know how reliable the leader of the KGB can be. I mean, it's not the most reliable organization, and the Soviets were not the most truthful government. All I can say for certain is that he did not survive that battle in Berlin. He did not go to South America, because if he did, people would have realized it and he would have been a more high profile person. He would have tried to grab power again. There's no doubt in my mind.